2 months ago, the United States and Israel launched the largest military operation in the Middle East in decades. Under the codename Operation Epic Fury, American planes and Navy, along with Israeli fighter jets, struck hundreds of targets across Iran in just 12 hours. 3 separate locations where senior Iranian officials had gathered were hit within minutes of each other. Among those targeted was Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, who was eliminated in the opening minutes along with dozens of senior commanders. President Trump later announced that Iran had no navy, no air force and no radar left, but what looked like a total victory was about to become something very different. Within hours, Iran hit back. Hundreds of ballistic missiles and drones were launched at Israel, while American military bases across Bahrain, Jordan, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates came under fire. A drone struck the British military base in Cyprus. Missiles were shot down over Turkey, and explosions were reported as far away as Oman and Azerbaijan. Then Iran played its most powerful card. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps shut down the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which 20% of the world's oil supply passes every day. The International Energy Agency called it the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market, and this was only the beginning. 40 days later, instead of the unconditional surrender that the American president had demanded just weeks earlier, a 2-week ceasefire was brokered by Pakistan. The fact that the talks between both sides were even announced showed that Iran's regime had survived. Its government was still functioning, its military was still launching missiles weeks after the initial strikes. Most importantly, Iran still controlled the Strait of Hormuz, and it continues to use it as a leverage in negotiations to this day. So how did the most powerful military in the world end up negotiating with a regime it set out to eliminate? The answer is complicated, and to fully grasp it, we need to go back 80 years in history. In 1945, after the Yalta Conference, American President Franklin Roosevelt made an unscheduled stop in Egypt. There, aboard the American Navy ship, he met Saudi King Abdul Aziz for the first time. Roosevelt knew that massive oil reserves had been discovered in eastern Saudi Arabia, and that the center of gravity in global oil production was shifting to the Persian Gulf. The two leaders struck an unwritten deal that would shape the next 80 years of American foreign policy in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia would guarantee a reliable oil supply to the United States, and in exchange, America would provide military protection. This agreement ensured that neither Britain nor the Soviet Union would take control of Saudi oil, and it pulled the United States deep into the affairs of the Middle East. For decades, this arrangement worked. American influence in the Middle East expanded, and oil flowed freely. But in 1979, one country started to undermine the entire system. Iran's Islamic Revolution overthrew the American-backed leader and turned the country from a reliable partner into Washington's most determined regional adversary. What followed was the devastating war between Iraq and Iran of the 1980s, during which the United States backed Saddam Hussein against Iran. Humiliated but not defeated, Iran began building what would become its most powerful tool: a network of armed groups across the Middle East, from Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza to the Houthis in Yemen. Iran was also a strategic ally of Syria during the rule of the Assad family. Tehran called this network the Axis of Resistance, and its goal was to encircle Israel and challenge American dominance in the Middle East. Then, in 2003, the United States made a decision that would accidentally transform Iran into a regional power. By invading Iraq and removing Saddam Hussein, Washington eliminated Iran's biggest rival without Tehran having to fire a single shot. The power vacuum that followed was quickly filled by Iran-backed militias, which gained control over large parts of Iraqi politics and security. Iran's influence now stretched all the way to Lebanon through Iraq and Syria. The United States had spent roughly $2 trillion and lost thousands of soldiers in Iraq. During that same time, Iran gained more influence than it had in decades, and it did so at almost no cost. Emboldened by its expanding influence, Iran accelerated its nuclear program and continued to arm its network of proxies. At the same time, Hezbollah had grown into the most powerful non-state military force in the world. The Houthis were disrupting international shipping in the Red Sea, and Iran had begun supplying its drones to Russia. For use against Ukrainian civilians. Iran was simultaneously arming terrorists abroad, threatening its neighbors, and at the same time brutalizing its own people at home to keep the Islamic regime in power. But something fundamental had changed inside the United States. In the last decade, the American fracking revolution had turned the United States into the world's largest oil producer, pumping over 13 million barrels per day. For the first time in decades, the United States no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil for its own energy needs. This shift made Washington less interested in the region and less willing to commit resources to maintaining order there. Under President Obama, the foreign policy pivoted toward Asia, where the rise of China presented a far greater long-term challenge. The same fracking revolution that made America energy independent also made it less careful about the consequences of its actions in the Middle East, because the region simply mattered less than it used to. That is why President Obama tried diplomacy without committing much of the military resources to achieve a long-term peace in the Middle East. In 2015, the United States and Iran reached a nuclear deal, which limited Iran's enrichment capabilities in exchange for sanctions relief. But when Donald Trump entered the White House for the first time, he pulled the United States out of the agreement unilaterally, calling it the worst deal ever made. Without constraints, Iran restarted its nuclear program and accelerated the enrichment of uranium. Then, in January 2020, Trump ordered the elimination of Iran's most powerful military commander, General Qasem Soleimani, in Baghdad. Iran responded by striking American bases in Iraq. After this, a precedent was established that was characterized by a cycle of escalation that lacked any clear path toward resolution. But then, by 2025, something unexpected started happening. Without the United States even trying, Iran's network of proxies was falling apart. After the October 7 attacks in 2023, Israel launched a devastating campaign in Gaza that significantly degraded Hamas. Then in 2024, Israel turned on Hezbollah in Lebanon, nearly dismantling the organization and eliminating its leader. By late 2024, the Assad regime in Syria also collapsed, severing Iran's crucial land bridge from Tehran to the Mediterranean Sea. The Houthis had been weakened by American and British strikes in the Red Sea, and Russia, Iran's most powerful ally, was too consumed by its own losses in Ukraine to project any strength in the Middle East. As a result, the Iranian regime was at its weakest point in years. Time was on America's side. It did not need a war, but Trump launched one anyway. Operation Epic Fury had been planned for months. American and Israeli intelligence agencies conducted what they later described as strategic and operational deception, while the negotiations between the Americans and Iranians to limit Iran's nuclear capabilities were still ongoing. Just hours before the first missiles were launched, Oman's foreign minister reported that Iran had agreed to zero enriched uranium stockpiling and full international verification. A deal appeared to be within reach, but President Trump nevertheless decided to launch the attack. The military results themselves were devastating. In the first 10 days alone, American forces struck over 5,000 targets across Iran. 50 Iranian naval vessels were damaged or crippled, including a frigate that was torpedoed off the coast of Sri Lanka. Iranian nuclear facilities were hit, while its ability to launch missiles dropped dramatically. On paper, the operation looked like an overwhelming success, but Iran still had one weapon that no amount of air power could neutralize. Shortly after the first strikes, Iran, with the help of drones and mines, closed the Strait of Hormuz, and the global economy felt it immediately. Within days, oil prices surged past $100 per barrel. The Revolutionary Guard blew up commercial vessels attempting to transit the waterway, and shipping insurance was pulled entirely, making it almost impossible for tankers to pass through. American gasoline prices jumped 30% in a single month, while the Federal Reserve estimated that the closure could reduce global economic growth by almost 3%. The Gulf states that host American military bases were hit hardest. Kuwait and Qatar faced potential GDP declines of 14%. Food imports to the region were disrupted, and the desalination plants that provide almost all drinking water in some Gulf countries came under fire. The military campaign had created an economic disaster, and when the United States needed its allies the most, they were nowhere to be found. No allied nation nation joined the coalition against Iran. The United Nations Security Council did not pass a resolution endorsing the strikes. The United Kingdom allowed only limited defensive use of 2 military bases. Countries from Spain to France and Italy voiced concern or outright condemnation. The isolation was largely self-inflicted. In the months before the war, the Trump administration had imposed tariffs on the European Union, the United Kingdom, Canada, and Japan, straining the very alliances that Washington now desperately needed. As the war dragged on, the geopolitical landscape shifted in ways Washington had not anticipated. Pakistan emerged as the primary mediator, working alongside China to push both sides toward a ceasefire. American public support for the war dropped, and even the opposition to the war within the Republican Party has been on the rise. In the Gulf, the economic model that has sustained countries like Kuwait and Qatar for decades was described as being in systemic collapse, and in Lebanon, the escalation between Israel and Hezbollah produced the deadliest single day since September 2024, with over 300 people killed in Israeli strikes just hours after the ceasefire was announced. The war had grown far beyond what anyone in Washington had planned for. Every stated objective of the war had fallen short. The goal was regime change, but the Supreme Leader's son was quickly named as his successor, and the Revolutionary Guard tightened its grip on the country. The goal was to end Iran's nuclear program, but there's a risk that the strikes might actually accelerate Tehran's pursuit of a nuclear weapon, since the regime now sees it as the only path to durable deterrence. The goal was to open the Strait of Hormuz, but Iran still controls it and is now demanding international recognition of its sovereignty over the waterway. Before the war, ships passed through Hormuz freely. After the war started, Iran had leverage it had never possessed before. But the most significant cost of the war may not be measured in the Middle East at all. Operation Epic Fury is draining the very military capabilities the United States needs to deter China. Aircraft carriers, strategic bombers, surveillance planes, and missile defense systems were pulled from the Pacific theater. A Marine Expeditionary Unit was redirected from Japan. Part of a missile defense battery was pulled from South Korea. The extended operations would create maintenance backlogs that could leave gaps in carrier availability for 2 to 3 years. More importantly, every tactical decision the United States made during this war is observed and logged by the Chinese military planners preparing for a potential invasion of Taiwan. And here lies the deepest irony of the entire war. The fracking revolution made the United States energy independent, which meant Washington no longer needed Middle Eastern oil for its own consumption. Yet the closure of Hormuz still crashed global markets, proving that energy independence does not mean energy isolation. The war did not protect American energy interests. Instead, it created a crisis that did not exist before the first missile was launched. Iran now possesses a new economic weapon that it can use for years to come. Gulf states that were never warned before the strikes now question whether American security guarantees mean anything at all. The 80-year-old bargain struck by President Roosevelt is now coming apart, and the implications extend far beyond the Middle East. After Iraq, Afghanistan, and now Iran, the appetite in Washington for further military engagement in the region is an all-time low. Gulf states are already hedging their bets, deepening economic ties with China, and exploring security arrangements that do not depend on the United States, with countries like Ukraine to build their own air defenses. The United States started the war against Iran with the most powerful military on the planet, the best intelligence capabilities, and total air superiority. And yet, a brutal regime that supplies drones to Russia to kill civilians, massacres its own citizens, and finances armed groups across the Middle East is still standing. Not because Iran is strong, but because the American strategy was fundamentally flawed. President Trump alienated the allies before the war, stretched the military during it, crashed global oil markets because of it, and handed Iran leverage it never had before. At this point, no one knows what victory actually looks like and how this war ends, but American actions will have consequences for generations to come.